I'm Annie Spencer, and I'm here to tell you a story called Horsetail Girl. And here, sitting around me, are these beautiful plants, the horsetails. Well, they're not plants, and they're not animals. They're somewhere in between. They're a mysterious being that's been on this earth for maybe 100,000 years. We don't know. The time of the dinosaurs. The oldest of us beings. We're even older than the story itself. And that story is surely old enough. We would say that it probably was first told when the soil was 5 fingers lower than it is now. It's a long time ago. Stories all come of their own volition. They're alive, you know. And this one came, I was in Canada, and I was going to have to do a ceremony with Vasilisa, which is an old Russian story. And I couldn't remember a little detail of the story, so I looked up on the internet, as one does. And there was a story, the story of Horsetail Girl, and I read it and thought, that's beautiful. And then went on to do what I needed to do with Vasilisa. And later I went back to find a Horsetail Girl, and I could not find her anywhere. So I just started telling the story as well as I could remember her. And then I think it was a year or two later, a good friend of mine, Ellie, found a book, and in that book was the story of Horsetail Girl, which was really, the bones of it were like I had remembered, but there was a little detail that I could then add in. So this is how that story came to me, and who knows how this story has arrived with you, but I hope it's had a good journey, and it's always worth telling the journey. Anyway, once a long time ago, there was an old woman called Biberikin, and she lived in a yurt, and in the pasture behind her yurt she had 5 cows which she milked, and she lived a happy and contented life. She was quite happy with her own company. But the one thing she did occasionally long for was a child, but she knew she was long past child rearing age. Anyway, one day her 5 cows all disappeared, and she was quite worried because they were all about to give birth to their calves. And you know, cows do, like a lot of animals, they're inclined to wander off when they're going to give birth because they want to go somewhere quiet, so that there will be a peaceful time when they sit down and can't focus on anything with this new life coming from them. So she asked crow, and she asked fox, she asked this animal and that. None of them would tell her where the cows were. But finally the eagle led her to this beautiful big tree with low-hanging branches and great roots up on a small hill, and there under the tree, munching contentedly, each with a newborn calf, were her 5 cows. And there, growing beside the cows, was this strange, almost a plant. And she thought, oh, maybe from this one something magical will come. So she very, very, very carefully dug it up, being very careful not to damage the tiniest root or the tiniest twig. And she took her cows home, and she carried the plant home with her. And when she got home, she laid out a pillow, laid the plant on the pillow, and covered it with a blanket. And then she went to milk her cows. Well, the first milking was fine, but the second milking, just as her bucket was full, she heard some of the little bells on her drum tinkle, and then she heard a thimble fall to the ground. So she jumped up, spilling all the milk, and rushed in and pulled back the blanket. The horsetail plant was just a horsetail plant. Oh dear, she said, I've spilled a whole bucket of milk, never mind. So she came back, she sat down with the 3rd cow, milked the cow at the same. Just at the end, the little bells tinkled, and she heard a needle fall to the ground. And again she jumped up, knocked over her bucket, because she was very nervous, you know, was something magical going to happen with this plant, or was she just a foolish old woman? She rushed inside, pulled back the blanket. There was the plant lying there on the pillow. She went back and said, who's trying to spill all my milk? So the 4th bucket, the 3rd time, again the bells tinkled, and this time the scissors fell down, and she couldn't stop herself. She jumped up again she spilled the milk, she rushed in, she pulled back the blanket, and there was the most beautiful little girl. She had skin like white marble. She had those pale blue eyes, bright like chalcedony. She had lips like dark stones, and she had black hair and black brows, thick, shiny, like two sables, as if two sables were lying across her forehead and just meeting in the middle. She was so happy. She picked up, and the little girl had a dress on, but the dress was transparent, and through the dress she could see the girl's body, and through the body she could see the girl's bones, and she could see her nerves, and they were like mercury, as the energy of her life was buzzing up and around her body. She was so happy with this girl, so she picked her up, she took her out, because there was one more cow, the fifth cow to milk. She put her on her lap, she milked the cow, and that was the first food that the little girl got from her. Well, all went well. They enjoyed living together, the girl grew, they told stories, they laughed, they told jokes, they sang songs, they milked the cows. All was lovely, and time passed, and the girl got to be, shall we say, beginning to be a young woman at that time when you think a big change is going to come into her life. And she was even more beautiful than she had been before. There's that time with girls when they just blossom. It doesn't last so long, but while they're blossomed, nobody can resist them. Well, at this time, meanwhile, there was a fine young hunter called Horsetail Girl, and he was the son of Toyon, who was the ruler of the land around there. And he was very handsome and very good at hunting and all these things, and a little bit full of himself. Anyway, he went out hunting one day, and usually he could take a deer, maybe a hare, something, you know, a wild turkey, whatever. But this time, he was unable to shoot anything, and he got quite annoyed. So by the end of the day, he saw a squirrel, and I generally wouldn't bother with a squirrel. But he thought, I'm getting that squirrel, I can't go home empty-handed. So he took up his bow, and he took aim, and he fired, and he missed the squirrel. The squirrel chattered like squirrels do, and hopped away across the branches. And he was furious, and went in pursuit. And he rode on his horse, and he rode and rode, kept on shooting at the squirrel, couldn't catch him. Finally, the squirrel jumped across, I think it was a willow, then a rowan, then a larch. It was up high in the larch, and the branches were sort of waving like that, and it was right by the old woman's yurt. This young man had one arrow left, and he took aim and he shot, but the light was bad because evening was coming on, and he missed it. He couldn't believe it, and the arrow fell down the smoke hole into old Beaverkin's yurt. So he got off his horse, stomped to the door and said, oh woman, bring me my arrow." Nothing happened. Oh woman, bring me my arrow." Nobody came. Arrogance started creeping up the back of his neck. He threw open the door to go in and shout around a bit. But the first thing that caught his eyes was this beautiful white-skinned, blue-eyed girl with the black brows like sables across her forehead. He was struck dumb. He just stood there. He couldn't say anything. He was totally overwhelmed. And when he came to his senses, he turned on his heel, long forgotten about the arrow, walked out, shut the door carefully, got on his horse, rode home to the palace, went straight to his mother and father and said, "I've found a girl I'm going to marry." Well, he'd been a bit of a, flirt, because he was, after all, the king's son, so everyone would have liked to be married to him, and he was very handsome, and he was a really good hunter. So his mother said, "Oh yes, we've heard this one before." "No," he said, "this is quite different." "But who is she?" No one knew who she was. Everyone knew about the old woman who kept cattle, but she wasn't exactly of high family. Anyway, the boy persisted, so 9 men dressed in red were sent on 9 horses to ask for the girl's hand in marriage. So they rode out to old Beaverkin's yurt, got off their horses, tethered them up, and a little more politely went and knocked on the door. And when they were invited in, they went in, and again, those 9 men, when they saw that beautiful girl, they were completely thunderstruck, and they wished they'd been the first one to see her. Anyway, 8 of them couldn't bear it. He staggered off, got no horses, and rode back to the palace, but the oldest one stayed. And he spoke to the old woman. He said, "I've been sent by the Kana himself, his son, who I think you may have met, and he apologizes for his rudeness, is asking for the hand of your daughter in marriage. And old Beaverkin said, well, fine by me, but you better ask her. I'll ask her. It all depends on her. So she turned to her and said, would you like to marry that rather arrogant young man who came into our house? The girl was young. He was handsome. She didn't really know anything, so she said, well, why not? Oh, yes. So it was decided, and the old woman said, fine, it's decided, but I will give her a hand in marriage when you fill my backfield with cattle and horses as a bride price. So that was no problem for the father. So after a while, the young prince came to collect his bride, and he brought a beautiful horse for her. It was a dappled horse, dappled grey, and the horse had silver bridle, silver work on the saddle, and a silver whip stuck into the saddle. And this was the last talking horse in the land. There had used to have been many, but there was just one left. This horse would still give advice to humans. Anyway, so the girl sang her thanks and her farewells to the old woman, and they hugged one another. They'd been so happy. You must come soon to visit me. I will come soon and visit you, she said. And she climbed on the horse, and she and the prince rode off into a forest, because there was a great forest between the yurt and the palace. And they were right sort of in the middle of it. It was quite dark, and the girl thought, gosh, this is different, you know, to where I've been. And the prince suddenly said, oh my goodness, you know, I hunt foxes. And in this forest I've got traps, and I've just remembered I haven't looked at my traps. I must go and look at my traps. You know what men are like. I've got work to do, and I must go and do my work. The girl says, but we're in the middle of something. He said, no, my work's the most important thing. So she said, well, what am I to do? I don't know where to go. I have no idea of the way to your palace. There's no problem, he said. Continue along this path till you come to a fork. Over one road will hang a sable skin. Over the other road will hang a bear skin. You'll know it. The bear skin will have a little white patch at the throat. Don't go down past the bear skin. Take the path of the sable skin, and you'll be fine, and I'll catch you up before we get to the palace. And he insisted, and off he went. And the girl was really frightened, because she was mostly a plant, and her life had been spent, you know, rooted in one place. And then she'd lived with the old woman. This is the first time she'd been out travelling, so she was really nervous, and there were noises in the forest, and she didn't know what they were from, and the horse was going along, and finally they came to the fork in the road, and there was the sable skin, and there was the bear skin, and which way was she supposed to go? And you know what, she was in such a muddle, and she was so nervous. You know, when you're nervous, you forget. She couldn't remember. So in the end, she took the road under the bear skin. This was not a good choice. And she didn't go very far, but she rounded a corner, and there was a yurt. But this yurt wasn't made of skin. It wasn't made of canvas. It wasn't made of wood. It was made of iron. And they often say that when iron was discovered, trouble came to the land. Because iron is a harsh metal. It cuts. It's a very sharp cutter. And things started to be cut in pieces. And things started to be cut away from other things. And separation started. But she knew none of this. She just came to an iron yurt, which looked pretty ugly. And out came a terrifying woman who had thick tangled hair, one eye in the middle of her forehead, a tongue, black tongue that stretched down to her waist, one withered arm and one withered leg, not an egg. And she came and just, ha 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 ha, good to see you, my girl, good to see you. Get off your horse, come into my house. And the girl was so frightened she didn't know what to do. So she, you know, remember, she was young, she was innocent. She hadn't really gone through anything to know how to deal with anything new in the world. She didn't have her power yet. So she got off her horse and went into this rather dark and horrible yurt. And once she was in there, the woman said, I want to try your clothes on. Take off your clothes. Take off your jewellery. Take off everything. And the girl looked round the yurt, and the terrible creature had shut the door. What was she to do? So she took off her clothes and her necklace, and as soon as she got them off, the creature came forward and put forward her long-nailed hand and raked down the face of the girl and took her whole face off. and smeared it and slapped it onto herself. And then she put the clothes on and she put the jewels on, and she looked, even the eyebrows were there, she looked pretty much like the Horsetail Girl. The Horsetail Girl was now lying in a terrible state, so the woman just kicked her into a hole on one side of the yurt, strode out, leapt onto the horse, and went back to the crossroads, went under the sable, and went on her merry way to the palace. Oh dear, oh dear. Meanwhile the prince, who really was not much better yet, came galloping up just as she was about to arrive at the palace. Hello, hello, terribly sorry I was so long, here I am. Looked at her, she looked much the same. Thought, oh, same girl. Didn't notice anything different. And in they went. But when they got to the palace, there was the 9 brothers and 9 sisters came rushing out to, there was a gold hitching post. And the brothers were going to take the reins of their horses, and the sisters were going to tie them to the hitching post. But this creature, who seemed to be the Horsetail Girl, did everything wrong. So she just stopped and hopped off the horse by a willow tree and tied it up roughly and strode in to the palace. So everyone's coming out to meet them, and what they've been told is that when this girl talks, beautiful red rubies will fall from her lips. And so all the girls have been making beautiful threads so that they catch up the rubies and make necklaces for themselves. And they've heard that when she walks along, wonderful sables, which are animals with beautiful thick black fur, will be running beside her. So the boys have made their bows and arrows already so that they can shoot them and make some beautiful fur clothing. But when this one starts to talk, horrible dull red beads fall out of her mouth, and there's sort of red, unpleasant little creatures running beside her that no one's interested in. However, they still think she's a Horsetail Girl, and she gets married to the prince, and they settle down to live an ordinary life. But he doesn't like it. All the food she cooks is burnt, and when she makes a new shirt for him, it falls apart the minute that he puts it on. She's not kind. When he's in bed with her, her body's very lumpy. He said, why are you so lumpy? And she says, because the old woman constantly put jewels on me, and it made it very lumpy as I was growing up. Well, so the boy is disappointed. After all, what he thought was so beautiful had turned out not to be so wonderful. But now we're going to go back to old Beaverkin, the old woman that the Horsetail Girl lived with. And she's there not feeling too good about everything. She doesn't know why. And then she has a dream. And in the dream, she sees the girl, half dead, 3/4 dead, lying in a hole. And she sees where that is. So she goes out walking in the woods, and she walks and she walks and she searches and she searches until she comes to the iron yurt. And she goes into the iron yurt and she peers down into the hole. And there in the bottom of the hole is this 3/4 dead, but with a very, very weak voice. I'm here. I'm here. So she somehow climbs down, pulls Horsetail Girl up, takes her home, puts her to bed, feeds her, and heals her of all her wounds, both her body and her soul, until she feels much better. So when the girl is better, then the old woman says to her, now tell me your story. What happened? I thought all was going to be good for you. So the girl told about how she'd gone into the woods and the boy had gone off with a foxtrap and she'd found this terrible creature, and the creature had stolen her clothes and even her face. She said, she took, by taking my face, she took my fate. My fate was to go and live with this young man and have his children, and she's stolen it from me. And she said, and then her grey dogs tore me into pieces. It was so, so terrible. I can hardly bear to remember it. And she said, and what's to happen to me now? Will I never see my prince again? The old woman said, don't you worry. You will see your prince again. Now the interesting thing is that if you remember, the girl rode off on a horse that could talk. And although the horse had seen everything that had happened, he went back to the palace and the horse never said a word to anyone until the girl started telling her story to the old woman. And when the girl started telling her story to the old woman, the horse started speaking, and he was down in the stables in the palace. He spoke to the stable boy and he said, you need to either bring the king here or take me to the king. I have very important news for him. So the stable boy went running off, and soon the king came down to the stable and he said, okay, so what do you have to tell me that's so important? And the horse said, you have an imposter in your palace. Your son is not married to the beautiful maiden. He's married to a monster who is posing as a maiden. And then the horse told the whole story about what had happened, for the horse had been there and seen it. And the horse said, this girl who came to marry your prince came from another land. She was a beautiful being, and she first came to this earth. She was a crane. She and her sisters danced beautifully, and the most beautiful of them was taken and turned into a horsetail plant. And then the old woman found a horsetail plant, and the rest you know. If you don't make this wrong right, I will destroy your kingdom. You will be left with nothing. So the king was in a great state. So he called for his son, and he told his son, and the son was absolutely, he had never in his life been so angry. And the horse said, this is what you must do to this monster. You must get a wild horse and tie her to it and set it free to rush off out into the moors. So they did as she had asked, and the horse dragged this dreadful creature out into the moors, and she died, and some of her energy, her eyes became the stars that come out in the cold of the winter and freeze everybody. And her body broke into many pieces that became the worms and the snakes and the creepy crawlies that now inhabit our land. So that's what happened to her. And so some difficulties came to the land for humans, but it was better than it was. And the horse said, and as for the boy, he's not fit to go and reclaim his bride yet. He needs to be cleansed, because he's been lying with this monster and her energy has got into him. So for 30 days he had to lie in a river that had just recently come from a glacier. So it was cold as ice, and for 30 days he lay while that water ran over him and cleaned out his body. And then for another 30 days, they took him and they tied him up in a tall pine tree so that he might be dried by the south wind and he might be dried by the north wind. And when they took him down after the 30th day, he was half dead. So they helped him to recover, but he was clean now. He was clear now. He had come through this difficult ordeal. He had come through this initiation, and maybe now he was ready to make a good husband. And maybe the girl had been through her ordeal as well, her initiation. Maybe now she was ready to go out into the world and find her own way when she had to. Anyway, he then was so desperate and eager to jump on the horse, so he jumped on his horse and he went galloping off to old Beaverkin's yurt, and he jumps off his horse when he gets there, and then he stops himself, stands by the door, knocks. He's learned. He's a different person now, and waits till he's invited in. And he comes in, and the old woman falls on him as if he would come back from the dead. How wonderful to see you again. Welcome, welcome, boy. How good it is that you have come back to us. And the prince turns and he says, I am so sorry, and I've come to claim Horsetail Girl to be my bride. And Horsetail Girl pulls herself up and says, you have to be joking. After what I've been through, then she tells him everything that happened to her. You think you left me to that fate? And you think that I'm now going to forgive you and come and marry you? And he says, but I didn't leave you to that fate. I told you I didn't tell you to go down the wrong path. It wasn't exactly my fault. And they started squabbling away, you know, like we do. And the old woman came in and sat down between them. And she stroked the face of one of them. She stroked the face of the other one. And she took their face, their hands, and kissed them. And said, stop now. Do you really not want to fulfill your fate now that you can? Can you not forgive him? You know what you've come to do, she said to the girl. The Horsetail Girl stilled herself and said, all right, I will forget all those things and I will go with you again. So they said goodbye to the old woman, and he again had brought the daffodil talking horse with the silver bridle and saddle and whip. She climbed on, and this time he would never have gone off out to look for his traps. And they went into the forest. They rode for a long time, and they rode through the autumn and saw how fruitful it was. And they rode through the winter and experienced how cold it was. And they rode through the spring and saw all life coming back again. And so they spent a good time between old Beaverkin's yurt and the palace, getting to know one another, as one should. And finally, they arrived back at the palace, and everyone was so excited. And the girls this time thought this is really the time that they wore their fingers raw, making the most beautiful threads on which to thread, because they were hoping this time rubies would fall from her mouth. And the boys made new bows and new arrows that would honour the sables, should the sables be running by her. And she came and she rode up to the golden hitching post, and there were the 9 maidens, and there were the 9 brothers, and they took the reins as they got off, and they tied them to the hitching post. And she walked into the house, and she took 3 tops of larch trees which were made ready for her, and she made a fire, because that's how it is. It's the woman who makes the fire in the home, and once the fire is in the home, in the house, then the home begins to exist. So she knew what to do, and she did it well. And it was true, when she first talked, when she first arrived, rubies fell from her lips, and as she walked around, these beautiful sables with thick, shiny fur walked with her, and the boys did shoot some of them, because that was their custom. And then there was a grand marriage feast, and people came from far and wide, and the travelling nomad people came, and neighbours came, and of course old Grandmother Beaverkin came, and the ancestors, those that lived up above in the skies, they came, and those who lived below the earth, they came, and everybody feasted for days and days and days, and finally the feasting was done, and everybody went home, and some ancestors, the 12 of them, went up into the sky, and the 9 of the others went down below the earth, and the young couple started to live their ordinary life. And we have to remember who we are. I think it's time I went home and had a cup of